Hello and welcome to this episode of the Optimising Human Performance podcast with me, Martin Jones.
And me, Jonpaul Nevin.
Today we're diving into the fascinating world of mixed martial arts with Duncan French from the UFC Performance Institute.
I've had the pleasure of working with over 40 different professional Olympic sports, and certainly mixed martial arts is the most challenging sport to figure out. There's so many ways to succeed, so many ways to win.
What does it take to become a successful fighter, both psychologically and physically?
The best athletes are those that elevate their basal exposure to a higher standard. So every time they go on the mats, you see the training intensity, the skill acquisition that comes with that intensity is elevated, and they recover really well.
We discuss how the extreme pressures of the sport can impact athlete performance.
I personally believe that overreaching is endemic in combat sport. Our athletes put themselves in overreach states, so they're underperforming on a pretty regular basis as a consequence of fatigue, of inflammation, of pain, of soreness, of just the wear and tear of the grind.
How can sports science help? And what can an understanding of MMA teach the rest of us?
People can learn something from professional mixed martial artists. Situational dominance and situational awareness, tactical and technical abilities to control a situation, I think is very transferable.
Duncan, welcome to the Optimising Human Performance podcast. How are you today?
Good, man. Thanks for the invite. It's great to connect with you guys. Excited about the next hour or so. It'll be good.
Oh, no, mate, likewise, but we're uber stoked to have you on the episode today because I'm sure our audience will dial into this one. Probably really good if you could give our audience an introduction to yourself, your background, where you've came from, and obviously where you're currently at.
I'm currently the Senior Vice President of the UFC Performance Institute, based in Las Vegas. I'm in charge of leading a business unit that provides all the high-performance services for a global roster of about 720 UFC fighters around the world. So yeah, really working in the space of MMA with UFC fighters and UFC Academy fighters. My background is as a strength and conditioning coach and a sports scientist. My PhD was from a US university. From then I moved back to the UK and dropped into the British Olympic system for about 12 years or so. I did 3 Olympic cycles. I was part of the English Institute of Sport, as it was called back then. It was a multi-sport environment where I was working with lots of different athletes and backgrounds, which was a melting pot of learning for me. It's great to be able to take basic principles, apply them to different sports. And I was also leading certain areas with boxing at the time in the northeast of England, going into the Beijing Olympics. And then for the London Olympics, I was the head strength and conditioning coach for Great Britain basketball. Going into Rio, I was the head strength and conditioning coach for Great Britain taekwondo, and also Great Britain Paralympic swimming. And then I got a job at the University of Notre Dame, where I was heading up performance sciences. And then I got recruited to come and lead a new entity, which was being added to the UFC, which is a traveling roadshow. It's a circus that goes around the world and sells tickets to arenas and shows. So yeah, it's been a ride, man.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like it. You've been knocking around in the strength and conditioning world for as long as I can remember.
That's a backhanded compliment saying you're an old guy, Duncan.
Yeah, right. You're old as shit.
So I'm not that far behind you. But S&C's developed quite a lot, specifically within the UK. Obviously, the US NSC has been there for a long time, and obviously it's developed now established. But how do you feel the profession of strength and conditioning has developed, and mainly the UK over the past, 25 years almost?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to say I'm one of the OGs, but I kind of feel I am, in terms of where my career was at. And when I got into the UK strength and conditioning industry, I was coming back from my PhD in America. So I'd been exposed to strength and conditioning athletic departments in big-time colleges in America, and I brought a lot of that back, not only academically, but practically, right? So I was keen to drop into that. And at that time, strength and conditioning was a very new industry. There wasn't a lot of people doing it. And clearly America had it as a career pathway for a number of years prior to it becoming apparent in the UK. But I'm really excited about where the strength and conditioning industry's at. I think its growth is apparent, and the different diversity of which you can apply your trade as a strength and conditioning coach in this day and age is amazing. That can be very clinical and medical orientated. It can be with general population. It can be in elderly populations. Not everyone has to work with professional athletes or elite athletes. And I think when you just look at the industry as a whole, how research and academia is continuing to influence our insights and our understanding of training science and training methodology, the introduction and the evolution of technology and what that brings to the table. All of these different types of things, making it a super exciting environment to work in, like the level of the detail at which coaches now are thinking of human optimization and performance optimization and sport specificity and technical or discipline specificity or positional specificity. I mean, that's where it's gone to. It's just fascinating to see. I'm currently working in combat sports and combatives, and that's a huge growth area now in strength and conditioning in the UK and around the world. And so that reinforces where the whole industry is going.
Duncan, in your current position as a leader in the organisation, you mentioned this sort of a multidisciplinary approach to performance.
Yeah.
And in some of the multidisciplinary teams that I work in, we've got S&C, you've got psych, nutrition, sleep. What does it look like in your Performance Institute? What sort of services are provided to the athletes? And is there a hierarchy? Like in my world, everyone wants to go to the gym, but ultimately some of the other things might actually improve performance more for some people.
Yeah, that's because it's cool smashing up weights around and listening to gangster rap in the gym, but, it might not always be the best option, and you actually need to sit on the treatment table and get some therapeutic support. Do you know what I mean? Our system is a little bit of a reflection of me and my background. I was very cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary in nature in my training and my beliefs as a physiologist and as a sports scientist, and trying to understand all the constituent parts that went into optimization. How do you optimize the human for performance, whatever performance may be? If that's, a mum taking the shopping out the back of the car and the groceries, or if that's someone that's got a sprint in less than 10 seconds and a 100-meter sprint, how do you optimize that? What are all the constituent parts? I think it's a pretty naive approach to say, well, that's not a multifactorial ecosystem. So, we take that principle and we obviously magnify that here at the Performance Institute. We've got pillars in strength and conditioning, in sports medicine, in performance psychology, in sports science, in nutrition, in culinary services, talent development. We've got 7 verticals that are core to our operation that athletes in the UFC can access all of those parameters. Now, what I would say is that no one discipline is any more important than another at any moment in time. We are flexing and pivoting based on the situational needs of an athlete or of an individual. Now, that might be a 6-week block of high-intensity training for a conditioning and a bioenergetic initiative. And after that 6 weeks, that might become subservient to a more nutrition orientation, all right, because they might be moving into a fight camp and they might need to start thinking about making weight, which is integral to our weight classification needs. So we've got a system that pivots and flexes. It's not one size fits all or a cookie cutter approach. It's about understanding how do you continually work to define the goals, the needs, the KPIs and the objectives that you're working to on a short term and an intermediate term. Everyone wants to be a world champion, all right? So we've got to build that across time. And if that's an Olympic quad, if that's looking at someone that's well established in the UFC and is close in the top 15, or someone that's his first fight in the UFC, what does that pathway look like? But ultimately, when you start to look at services and development of individuals, you've got to look towards those intermediate term goals and objectives, because that's what shapes the service infrastructure and how you wrap around the portfolio of capabilities that are on offer to us in Pandora's box of sports science and medical services that we can offer in this day and age.
I lived in Canada for a few years around when Georges St-Pierre was the big name, sort of like late 2000s, and watched a lot of UFC, and there's some characters in the sport.
Just a few.
Yeah, I'll say that. Some interesting characters. Now, when I see some of those characters, I recognize some people I've worked with, and buy-in for me can be really hard, especially when you've got these like uber alpha characters who seem to have that very, this is my way, I am who I am, I train how I train.
Yeah.
Does everybody come to these performance institutes with their eyes wide open and want help, or is it a battle to try and win them over and get buy-in into these services?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's kind of the law of thirds. A third want everything, give me everything. A third are much more targeted and strategic about what they want and why they want certain support or expertise at a moment in time. And another third might be very dismissive and say, I've got it all figured out, which is fine. That's the world we live in. And I think it's a double-edged sword, in as much as buy-in is a huge thing. We work with fighters, and fight mentality is to go through no matter what. I am going to go through, I'm going to get beyond where I am right now, and I'm going to fight through this process. We don't want to dumb that down. That fighter mentality, the warrior spirit, is endemic to the population that I work with right now. We actually have to embrace that, and often it's about trying to pull the horses back rather than push them. In other sports, it's been very different for me, you know what I mean? So I think, the fighter mentality, the warrior spirit, pre-profiles our athletes to a particular psychology and a mentality. We've got to be very cognizant of that, and we've got to be very aware of it. The other thing off the back of that, though, is that we can potentially provide them with information or tools or tactics that are going to be complementary to that. So it's not that we're trying to change that mentality. We know they've got to go to some deep, dark places and be in deep water at times. And that's something that we as providers have to potentially change our mentality a little bit. The way I look at a soccer or a football team and what those players are doing is very different to the way I look at an MMA fighter, okay? Knowing what they're actually going to go through. That's not to give soccer players a disservice, but you've got to understand your clientele. And that's what we certainly do here at the Performance Institute. But then again, it's about looking at individual needs within an understanding of knowing what you're going to be doing on the mats or in the gym on a daily basis. How can we provide complementary things that are going to either alleviate pain or alleviate a workload challenge or provide you some nutrients that's going to actually make your training more impactful or more optimized with very simple strategic approaches. And that's how we work. We know that every fighter we work with, some are very embracing in what we can offer them from a expertise perspective. Some are more standoffish. They're the expert. They're the CEO of their own company as the fighter. So we are servants to their needs and wants, and we've got to be creative of trying to find the things that they really value within our service offering.
Yeah, sure. So if you're contracted into the UFC, it's up to you. You can use the services if they want them.
They're independent contractors, right, which again is a really unique thing, because if you think about Manchester United or the New York Yankees, they own the rights to their players, right? They can mandate what their athletes do at any moment in time. We can't do that with our athletes. They're independent, and it's very much their own desire to engage. But we work with about 87% of that total roster at any moment in time in different facets, from competition support around fight week to remote service and engagement to in-person offerings. So I think we've got a good engagement, and the good thing about our ecosystem is that athletes vote with their feet. So if they see competitive advantage and a benefit to what we potentially can provide them or offer them, they're going to come. And right now, close to 90% of the roster are coming to use our expertise and our services. And that's very rewarding to us. It shows we're doing something right.
Yeah, that's a strong statistic, 90%. I bet most practitioners would love to get that kind of buy-in. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Duncan, I'm going to sort of expand upon the point you were discussing there. So within the military and what we call high-stress, high-stakes environments, the concept of human performance optimization has gradually gained traction.
Yeah.
So it first came out in the literature in 2005, 2006 in the DoD over in the US. And how DSTL are defining it in the UK is the use of science and technology to enhance human performance capabilities up to the limit of one's biological potential. And human augmentation being use of science and technology to enhance performance capabilities beyond the limit of biological potential. And the idea is, well, that's low-hanging fruit. Why don't we dial in the human, the system first, before we start spending money on exquisite technologies? The concept is that humans are more important than hardware, and the quality is more important than the quantities, is an often used term. Now, within the US, there's been a number of HPO initiatives which have been rolled out at scale. Ranger Athlete Warrior, Holistic Health Force Fitness, Preservation of the Force and Family for SOCOM. And obviously what they're trying to do is deliver HPO at scale. And that's always going to be a big problem for these organisations, because if you've got 500 dudes in front of you trying to individualise for that number, it's not going to happen. So it's regression to the mean. But there's still this belief, and I'm a strong advocate of as well, that we can certainly fine-tune the delivery of interventions to enhance physical readiness, psychological resilience, cognitive capability, nutritional or healthy sleep behaviours, whatever it is. So given that challenge, do you think there's things that those organisations could potentially learn from the UFC and the work that you're doing at your Performance Institute, whereby they could take some of the strategies and roll them out at scale to deliver an effect? Not necessarily enhance health and well-being, but enhance occupational task performance, so they can go out and do what they need to do and be successful?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I'm not going to say that the UFC Performance Institute's got everything figured out in the world of mixed martial arts. I think we're very advanced and we've got a good awareness of what we're doing, but I think there's a lot of transference, and clearly there's a synergistic relationship between military operators and combative athletes in professional mixed martial arts, right? Whether that's caloric restriction, whether that's sleep deprivation, whether that's combative and workload management and these types of kind of narratives, these two populations clearly get along and understand each other. What I would say is that what we've tried to do is define the cultural movements that we needed to make. Culturally within the community, within our MMA community around the world, how can we start to elevate everyone's awareness in basic principles of managing numbers of athletes on the mats, or how many times in a week should we have a training exposure, or how do we build a training week so that we can look at recovery and regenerative activities, So there's certain things which I think are cultural movements. How can we endorse and support like a cultural ripple effect that over time changes people's behaviors and elevates the whole conversation? So we believe we've done that to some extent. A good example of that for us is athletes making weight and the processes and the methods that they're using to try and make weight. And again, we've got really powerful data sets to show how in the last 8 years we've impacted things like the amount of missed weights and how athletes are doing that activity. It's a very discrete thing, obviously, for competition. So there's kind of cultural initiatives which we constantly are trying to reinforce, the big rocks within the global ecosystem of mixed martial arts. How are we shaping, a gym in Thailand? How are we changing one in China? How are we looking at what they do in New Zealand? And they look to the ivory tower of the UFC Performance Institute and say, well, what they're doing over there is what we need to kind of implement to some extent over here. The second layer of that is the individual now. And I think, yes, you've got to then start looking at bucketing approaches where you don't have to work on a super individual level like we do, but you can start to look at a very thematic approach to saying, all right, are you someone that is constantly fatigued? Are you someone that is lacking energy? Are you someone that picks up lots of niggles and injuries? Have you got repetitive chronic injuries that are not being addressed? Are you looking at someone that is less explosive than your teammates and your colleagues? And you start to build up buckets where, all right, now you've just put yourself in a particular funnel. You don't need high-level technologies. You don't need lots of data to reinforce this thing. I've just got to do a self-reflection exercise and say, okay, well, of the 10 things that the UFC Performance Institute or the military as a whole has told me I need to keep an eye on, well, 5 of them I'm limited by and 5 I'm really good. Okay, now we've got a strategy. That's the most basic strategy where I can start targeting those things. And now it's on me to go and seek out the information and the methods and potentially the experts that can help just give me a little bit of a bump in those 5 things that I'm self-reflecting on and I see limitations. So that's kind of how we do it here to some extent as well with our athletes. But clearly we can go down the rabbit hole to a deeper level on the individual engagement. But absolutely at the core of it is that we've got a cultural thing that we want to just elevate. It's in our mission statement, accelerate the evolution of mixed martial arts. Now that is on a global scale. That is for people that are not even in the UFC. We're looking to the next generation. How can we influence them so that when they do come to the UFC, they've already got good practices and performance behaviors that are going to be beneficial to them?
Awesome. Absolutely awesome words of wisdom.
I'm always interested in that bloke who puts his hand up and says, yeah, I'll fight. There might be someone gets injured and pulls out of a big fight, and there's always somebody who's there to step in. These individuals who just seem to be always ready, they're just waiting for their chance and they'll put their hand up and they'll have a fight with anyone at any time.
Yeah.
How do they do that? Is that something that people try and condition to be almost like 80% ready at any time?
Yeah, I think it's a brilliant point. You're almost reinforcing our mentality that we try and preach to our community, our fighters, right? We don't talk about 8-week fight counts. We talk about 52-week fight counts. It's a year-round thing. You're a professional, and being ready to take a short notice fight and get a payday is often part of the job. Some athletes let themselves slip a little bit because they've gone through a particular high intensity period of training in a camp and the restrictive behaviors that they have to go through in that camp. They fight and then they dial it back and they let things go a little bit, they slide. Whereas you also have other athletes that will go straight back into that habitual offering, that habitual level of training exposure that keeps them in that kind of robust and ready condition. And I think that's what we obviously support. Certainly there's downstream physiological negative consequences if you balloon and reduce your weight repetitively over time. It's not the healthiest approach. It's also not a mindset that is sharp every moment of every week. And I think the best athletes and the ones where you see longitudinal success are those that just elevate their basal exposure to a higher standard. So every time they go on the mats, you see the training intensity, the skill acquisition that comes with that intensity is elevated, and they recover really well. They take the time to recover because they know they've got to go back on the mats tomorrow at the same intensity, and they've got to get more skill acquisition. You know, they're only going to improve by doing more developmental work, by doing the training, by repetition, getting your reps in and doing those single leg takedowns, doing those grappling maneuvers, doing those striking combos. That's done by a standard that is reinforced from their mindset, their psychology, and the coaches that are around them on a weekly basis. But they also do the additional work to allow themselves to recover so that they don't fatigue over a 3-day period. Clearly there's high workloads and things like that, but what I'm trying to say is that they don't put themselves in a hole that it takes them 2-3 weeks to come back out of that hole. They're very smart operators, but it's this exposure to habitual training intensities that become the new norm for them. And I think when you look at Dagestani wrestling and just the amount of talented athletes that are coming out of these small countries and these small regions, and you see the nature of their training that they're doing, I think, number one, it's given me a new kind of perspective on just how much the body can tolerate and how much load it can be exposed to, but also just what that repetitive exposure over and over again can do to resilience and creating a new standard. So listen, I'm not saying don't recover or just smash yourself every day in the gym and you become a beast. You need to do the recovery piece, because tomorrow, yes, you do need to go and smash yourself again on the mat, potentially. So you need to understand the upregulation as well as the downregulation, and these two things have to be harmonious. And if you just neglect the downregulation, then yeah, you're going to get yourself into more trouble than good. But like I say, the best athletes in the world are the ones that can sustain a high exposure over time and don't take their foot entirely off the gas.
Do you see that across lots of different sports? I'm interested in the Novak Djokovic's of the world, who just seem to be going forever and maintaining such a high standard for such a long time and dominating a sport. I remember as a tennis fan seeing the likes of Pete Sampras retiring at 30, 31, and now Novak Djokovic is apparently looking at the next Olympics when he'll be 41. It's almost unheard of a few years ago. I mean, is sports science and S&C contributing to that longevity?
Yeah, I definitely think our understanding of training science and physiology, psychology, that's definitely influencing what we can expose an athlete to, and you know, how we can manage an athlete and their development. I think obviously MMA and fighting is a little bit different.
Just a bit, just slightly different. If Novak Djokovic was in an armbar every day, he might not be going to 41. Who knows?
It's still skill acquisition though, right? Every day there's a skill acquisition and an exposure to learning and technique development, tactical development. And I think that's a critical aspect of this thing as well, because you can take all sports and say, well, everyone has got a technical and a tactical development that they can make. And how do they create that environment for that to happen? And that goes side by side with the psychological and the physiological demands that the system is placed under as well. So this balance between how do you ensure skill acquisition can occur, even in someone like Novak Djokovic, right? He's still got the potential to create new skill sets, a new way of hitting the ball, a new way of moving around the court, a new way of breaking down a particular opponent that he might struggle with. So how is he developing those skills, and when? You can't do those under fatigue. You know, you can't always be uber fatigued and fatigued from a mental perspective. You need to have that ability to take on new skill sets. So again, now you start to really break down the structure of a learning environment and how do you optimize learning in sports. So I think there's themes that work across all sports. I just think some of them are really polarized by the nature of fighting. It's a sport of consequences, and the resilience and the physical and mental demands that are placed on the body on a day-to-day basis just takes you to potentially a different level of commitment and dedication. The consequences of hitting a tennis ball versus getting punched in the face are a little bit different.
Duncan, looking at MMA specifically, what are then the physiological, psychological, technical and tactical demands of the sport? Because obviously there's many disciplines that feed into it. obviously a training perspective, we're always trying to do a needs analysis. And I think the MMA, given its very nature, is going to be quite complex. So how do you sort of break it down and to develop your understanding as to what you may need to do?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways to answer this question.
This could be a podcast series in its own right.
That reinforces the complexity of our sport, right? I mean, I've had the pleasure of working with over 40 different professional Olympic sports in my career, and certainly mixed martial arts is the most challenging sport to figure out, the complexity of the sport. So, that's the backdrop of what we're working with. But ultimately, most athletes are coming potentially with a stylistic preference. Whether you're a kickboxer, stand-up is your preference, whether you're a jiu-jitsu player, whether you come with freestyle wrestling background. Although in this day and age, we're also seeing more and more people come with an MMA background. So 16-year-olds starting MMA, not going to a kickboxing class and transitioning from kickboxing as a predetermined emphasis. So we're seeing that movement culturally, that more people are coming with MMA skill sets. From a technical, tactical perspective, yeah, I mean, we obviously do a lot of data and tracking of the sport to understand where trends are going. I mean, you just need to look at the emphasis on lower leg kicks over recent years and how that's now become a predominant weapon in our sport. Okay, is that a skill set you've got, or is that something that you don't have? You've got to look at how you succeed in this sport. Can you take an opponent down to the ground? Can you defend a takedown? You can be the world's best kickboxer, but if you're on your back, it means nothing, So there's obviously trends and themes that ebbs and flows tactically within the sport, and I think being ahead of those is really important. But what we say from a preparation perspective is that when you are off camp, you should really be trying to elevate your low-hanging fruit. That's the time to increase skill sets that you don't currently have. So if I'm more emphasized on my striking skill sets, maybe we're doing more grappling and wrestling type activities. But when you move into a competition phase or a high intensity preparation phase, now you're essentially sharpening your skills. Now you want to take your X factors and make them super strengths. So philosophically, we're always juggling on a technical side between elevating the lowest hanging fruit versus working on your super strengths. I think from a physiological and a psychological perspective, there's parameters where we can say, glycolytic conditioning or lactic conditioning, anaerobic glycolytic conditioning is integral to our sport. That's a determinant of success. How do you do that? And how can we go about targeting that big rock that is so impactful for our athletes? You can look at numbers and start pursuing that very straightforward. We know you need a strong aerobic base. This is an intermittent repeat sprint sport for 25 minutes. So a conditioning base that allows recoverability is integral to supporting that glycolytic system. Then you start to get into the parameters of strength and power and speed. We look at wrestlers, they tend to come with about 4 times of body weight strength expression. You look at strikers, usually it's about 2.7%. Is that something we need to elevate, or is that something that you're comfortable working around? And that's now becomes a personal conversation with the athlete about how do they perceive success? What do they want to do? So there's many facets that go into the physiological side of it, but at its heart, it's a bioenergetic sport. Rarely do you hear people come out and say, I lost that fight because I just wasn't strong enough. But you hear a number of athletes come out and say, my conditioning was not on point. Blew my load and that was me done and I was out. So, okay, that's a bioenergetic conversation. We need to look at the conditioning parameters of our sport. And then, I always say the sport is 90% physical, apart from the 80% that's mental. So, listen, you just got to do everything in this sport, right? So the psychology of how you manage the attrition, the anxiety, walking out into a crowd, the desire to go and train on a daily basis and embrace the suck that is the journey rather than the outcome. It's not about the octagon. It's about the 8 weeks, the 10 weeks of preparation that go into just sucking for 12 weeks of rigorous combatives. That takes a certain mindset and a desire to get up every day and do that. So I think there's so many parameters that go into success in this sport. The beauty of it and why I got into it and why I love what I do is because there's still so many things to figure out and find out. It's an amazing math equation. And the other side of it, which is maybe a little bit more frustrating, is the law of equifinality tells us that in MMA, there's so many ways to succeed, so many ways to win. When you look at breaking down a 100-meter sprint or breaking down a 2K row, it's pretty predetermined what your splits need to be. And whilst there's environmental conditions and things that go into that, you can define how you do that. you can't translate that to mixed martial arts because chaos has got so many avenues to succeed. And that's kind of another intriguing thing about this sport.
Absolutely. I love sports like that.
Yeah, it's frustrating, but I mean, again, I don't want to say job for life type thing, but yeah, man, there's so many things to try and figure out, and what's complementary to success in what scenario, with what type of opponent, what's their stylistic preference, what's my stylistic skill set. The tactics alone are fascinating.
Yeah, the psychology of it, it's like that ability to navigate uncertainty. Like you say, a 100-meter sprint, you kind of know what's going to happen over the next 10 seconds. There's a lot of certainty around what you need to do. And similarly, a lot of closed skills. There's a lot of certainty around what the actual event is. From a psychological point of view, that's why I love getting my teeth into things where the man or the woman in the arena are just navigating uncertainty. They don't know what's going to happen. And to train somebody to be able to think in a way that allows them to perform when anything can happen. I love trying to unpick that problem, but it is difficult because you've got certain parameters and there's certain things that are more likely than others, but anything can happen.
Yeah, and I think that's the amazing thing about the sport, but it's also what gets some athletes into problems, right? Because you've got to have an encyclopedia of answers now. To chaos, you've got to have an outcome or a solution to every situation or every scenario that could present itself. So that means you've got to put yourself in different problems and different challenges and different scenarios and try and figure them out. And that's kind of this sport, is that there's so many ways to win and succeed. And therefore, if an athlete feels like they haven't trained enough, they haven't done enough work to fend off that rear naked choke, or to avoid that takedown, or to work against the fence in a particular way, they tend to just elevate their training exposure. I need to do this, I need to do this, I need to do that. I've got to do more and more and more because of all the chaotic eventual outcomes that I could be exposed to in this fight. So that's a double-edged sword because, yes, the demand to do high volumes of work is there, but ultimately there's a toll that comes with those high work volumes and those training loads. And again, I think that's the skill of balancing that, being confident enough to say, all right, I've done the work, I've got solutions to what's going to be presented, but also managing just how much exposure and training load you need to do to get to that point. It's a fascinating challenge to figure out for these guys and girls.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I like watching some of the old video clips from the early days of the UFC where you'd get some massive fat guy from a trailer park somewhere in the south, like just a bar brawler. You said that you need these people who have the mindset to want to train, to put themselves into a dark place and just work really hard. The history of the sport seems to be just these blokes who they like fighting. They don't have that mindset. They're just brawlers. I'm assuming they just don't exist in the sport anymore. The weekend warrior who's just an amazing brawler who can get lucky occasionally. Do they exist anymore in the sport?
Well, I mean, listen, there's another great question. What I will say is that we wish every world champion looked like, a Roman god, a Greek god.
Like JP, you mean?
Yeah. The fact of it is that if you just got a granite chin and you walk through people, you can get to the highest level of this sport with a limited skill set at times. You know what I mean? So it's frustrating because it's not always the best athlete that succeeds. It's not always the best technical practitioner that succeeds. What I will say, and to draw on a paradigm from Dianama Singer, who's our coach in our facility in Shanghai, he talks about FMA, all right? So the F is for a fighter, and how do we define the fighter? That's more the psychology, the grit, the desire to go through. How are we kind of stressing that and challenging that? The M is the martial artist. So again, that's the technical side of it. Can you throw a roundhouse kick? Can you do a single leg takedown? Can you do these skill attributes that are going to be integral to our sport? And then the A is the athlete. Okay, what are the parameters that you need to succeed from a conditioning, strength, power, speed, reaction perspective to at least succeed at the highest level in our sport? So, this FMA model is a very good way of packaging a narrative that means there's lots of constituent things that you need to consider to be successful. Now, you could have a superpower in the fight aspect, just being an amazing fighter, a brawler. You might not be the most technically gifted individual, but if you just flurry and storm somebody, maybe your fighting spirit is going to get you through. And maybe, like I say, you've got this granite chin. Other people are going to orientate towards athleticism and just outwork an opponent. Look at the Marabs of this world and the Sean Brady's of this world. These people have got huge engines, just amazing, amazing athletes. And then the martial artists, people like Alex Pereira, that are just technically gifted martial artists. Their weapons are just far and above anybody else. So you have to check a number of boxes from an archetypal perspective, but certainly people have got a predisposition to one or another.
At the moment, combatives and what we call weapons retention training is making a comeback within the military and police. And you sort of think that, well, maybe that should have always been a fundamental skill set. And it was for a long time, but I think it unfortunately got forgotten. And then recent operational experience has sort of brought it to light again. And obviously boxing was always a big thing in the British Army, and now jiu-jitsu is getting really big. But then people are trying to translate that into their operational roles. So within that, when the syllabuses are being developed in regards to combatives retention training, they're trying to keep it simple so then they can give as many people exposure to these skills to obviously go out and do what needs to be done. But with that in mind, is there anything, do you think, these organisations could learn from MMA as a sport in general in regards to develop and ingrain these skills, and more importantly, to be able to apply them at the right time, in the right context whilst under pressure?
I mean, I'm not an MMA coach myself, but my answer is yes. Kash Patel, who's the head of the CIA, I don't know if you saw in the media recently, saying that all CIA members are going to get trained by the UFC because him and Dana White are buddies. The point I'm making is there's this interpretation of people can learn something from professional fighters, from professional mixed martial artists, and I absolutely agree with that. I think situational dominance and situational awareness, and then looking at tactical and technical abilities and to control a situation, I think is very transferable, whether that's on the ground, whether you're face down, whether you're face up, whether that's on your feet, whether that's against the wall, whether that's trying to be offensive in fighting or defensive in fighting and self-defense. There's a lot of transferable skills, let alone just the psychology of what's the mentality you need, what's the mindset that you need to go into a fist fight, for want of a better term, with, to put yourself in a position to succeed. And that needs to be very cerebral. It can't just be raw aggression. It cannot just be like blitz and throw haymakers. There needs to be a cerebral approach to breaking down this math equation that's in front of me and having an awareness of the situation that I'm in. What's my current position in the chess match versus my opponent's position, and how can I dominate that kind of equation? So I think there's so many aspects that are transferable, let alone, all right, guys, you got to get in the gym and you just got to get fitter, you got to get healthier, you got to be able to work out for 25, 30 minutes at a click without any rest periods. There's fundamental basics like that, but I think there's so much more nuance to it that is amazing conversations for organizations like the military and like ourselves to sit in a room and just kind of figure it out. That's a really, really interesting thing that we can do.
Duncan, if we just loop back a second, you mentioned sort of the metrics and the data and the trends and all this stuff that you collect, and I'm guessing you're using a lot of the technologies that are available, and you probably used tons of them in previous sports you worked in. Are there any performance technologies that you feel are like massively overrated that just keep coming up and people keep using them? And equally, sort of aligned with that, is there anything that's just awesome, that is just a must-have technology if you were going to measure something? Is there anything that's like a must-have? You start with the overrated. Give us that one first.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I don't want to make any enemies in the industry. I mean, I just think there's technologies that do what they do. Understand that everything is a tool. It's not going to provide the answers. It's going to provide information that helps you make a better decision. So we're huge advocates of force plates, for example. I'm not bashing force plates. Like, we're huge advocates. But force plates have been around a long time now. We know what they do. We know what we can do with them, and they can't do anything else. Do you know what I mean? But some of that information is amazing and fantastic, and other parts of it is like, okay, well, they're kind of limited to what they can do. Reliability of information is critical when it comes to technology, and you've got to cut through the marketing bullshit. You know, a lot of these technologies are claiming to do things that they just can't do. And when we beta test them or stress test them in our ecosystem, in our environment of intermittent, repetitive chaos, they just fall flat, you know what I mean? So it's great if you're just doing a steady state 45-minute bike ride, which that's what they may be designed for. But that's not helping me with my athlete clientele and what we're trying to figure out here. So again, making sure that the tools that you're using are reliable and give you good information. Don't just believe what's on the packaging, because unless they can tell you exactly how they get to it and what they do and when they're giving you this information, I immediately start to get a little bit skeptical. Because if it's a black box mentality and you can't ultimately tell me what you're taking and what's informing your outputs, that's a red flag for me. I also think in the world of the gym, in the weight room, there's a lot of tools that get in the way. There's a lot of tools that actually just make it more of a messy environment. They're cool, but they don't inform on a day-to-day basis. That's the type of technology that I love. Things that are just endemic in our ecosystems, that we can capture and collect information in the most efficient way possible, that's not off-putting for the athlete, that's not off-putting for the coach, but gives you great insights and great information. And we can't dismiss simple health and wellness monitoring as well, because again, when you start to talk about the down-regulation side of it, sleep monitors, is it a good sleep monitor? Is it a crappy sleep monitor? Are you going to pitch your next 2 weeks of training on this 30% sleep recovery metric that you found today? Like, has now your whole training gone to shit because you're freaking out about something which is just a metric that is guiding a discussion and a dialogue? Like, how you handle the data and the information is almost as important as, is it good data or not? You know what I mean? Because we get that as well a lot. And certainly with fighters that are going into competition and into fight camps, the wheels can fall off if we're not careful. If they're exposed to a Garmin or a Polar or an Apple Health or whatever, and it's suddenly like you've had 2 nights of bad sleep, like the wheels can fall off an 8-week fight camp for no reason. And, we've got to be very careful of how we manage and handle some of this information, and when it's reported to an athlete, and when actually it's for experts like ourselves to just kind of keep that sacrosanct and internalize it a little bit more. So that's a kind of a roundabout way of answering your question without saying, well, yeah, this technology is crappy.
Yeah, I don't think you've made any enemies with that answer. That's a good thing. That's good. I'm glad you said it, because I've had experience really similar, like sleep tracking in particular. People saying they're getting really stressed out because they've not got enough deep sleep, or their REM stages are off or whatever. And it's the technology just can't tell you that stuff. It's a guess at best with a lot of these wrist-borne devices. So yeah, I think it's just endemic across so many different performance settings that sometimes a little bit of knowledge can be quite dangerous. And
yeah,
I like the way that you put it, that it's a conversation starter. It just allows you to engage with the athlete, help them understand what that data is, and maybe just calm them down a little bit sometimes.
And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. Yeah, if my HRV score or my sleep score is going up and down, or it's trending south, well, maybe I didn't have breakfast that morning. It's not actually that my sleep's bad, it's just my nutrition's off. Or maybe the training load response, the outputs in the gym are below optimal. Okay, well, maybe you had an argument with your wife yesterday and your mind's just not in the right place. So it's so easy to hang your priorities on this data point, on this information that is shared. Listen, I'm a sports scientist. I want to have objective measures and insights that direct my decision making. But I'm very pragmatic about the other side of that narrative as well, as like, don't let the wheels fall off just because you see a number and it's not the number that you like, because it's a very visceral response psychologically that can be very damaging to a preparation period for an athlete. So that's where I come back to, there's so many variables, symbiotic variables that can affect what that number is. And there's so many different things that go into it. And that's why it's pretty naive to not just step back and say, okay, that's the number, but what's gone into making that number? And can I determine the aspects and the things that influence it, to then say, okay, well, what do we do about this crap sleep number that is popping up every day? And then you can really start to open up all the different parameters that go into it.
As a coach, you're working with people. Is there any stuff that, that your eyes see that the data never sees? Have you got anything from your experience of just working with people where you think, hang on a minute, something's not right there, and you don't need the data? Like, what kind of stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I had a conversation this morning in my office about an athlete that's just low energy. That's not their normal persona. They're just kind of off. All right. So now there's a concern. It's like, okay, that's not the guy we know. Like, is everything cool there? Let's keep an eye on him. And the best sports science tool is saying, how are you doing today? You all right? Is everything good? No one wants to write research papers about that because it's not cool, it's not sexy, it's not billions of data points. But I tell you what, on a humanistic level, it's the best question you can ask anybody on a day-to-day basis to understand they're in a good place, or they're struggling, or they feel sore, or they're fatigued. Just ask somebody, how are you going today? That's the interpersonal piece. Because, yeah, like you say, at the end of it, we're working with a human. We're working with a deep-thinking organism that has got emotions, and tapping into those emotions, those feelings, is as important as measuring someone's biomechanics or their force output or the force velocity curve. On the pyramid of insight and understanding, that bottom foundational level, a level 1, is simply asking the question. And I think we often try to jump to level 6 when we could get more insights from something that's quite straightforward.
Yeah, I can relate to that. When I worked in defence rehab at Headley Court, that was one of the first things most ERIs would do in the morning, go in with their group, say, right guys, how you feeling today? And the response you got was the best bead on, right, can we push or do we need to pull? That was still the best tool which we had, without a doubt.
Yeah, and listen, we in our academy systems, we'll do things like session RPEs and SRSS scores, daily wellness monitoring type stuff. But as soon as you put it into one of those pro formas as well, as soon as you start to say, on a scale of 1 to 7, give me a score, you've made them think about their emotions and the feelings, but you've still changed the exposure and the experience. If you can be conversational, say, how are you feeling? And allow someone to articulate that in their own verbiage before putting that into something like an SRSS score, is still a really beneficial interface that's going to give you a lot of understanding. And I'm a huge advocate of those types of things because it's, it's the humanistic side of it. And we are animals that are built on relationships and how we relate to each other. And I think that's what you're trying to do. So even though we're working with killers on the fight scene from a combative perspective with UFC fighters and the world's best fighters, still the humanistic side is saying, hey, you're good today, everything all right? You seem a little bit quiet. That can open up a ton of insight. No technology is going to give you that amount of insight.
Yeah, the art and the science.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Is there anything that you see on a regular basis that you wish you didn't? You're talking about adapting, recovery. You want people to recover well, to enable them to adapt and retain or acquire new skills. Do you ever see stuff that you're just like, oh, they're not doing that again? What the coaches and athletes just keep getting wrong? I think they're known as zombie constructs or zombie ideas. You just can't kill them off. They just keep coming back. Are you still seeing any of that stuff?
I've never heard that. I mean, there's a few, but an understanding of the sport and what athletes do within this sport is important, right? They do things which other athletes and other sports won't do and don't do. But again, sometimes you start to think, okay, well, neglecting medical advice or medical guidance. And I think that's a really tricky conversation that we have on a weekly basis. It's through no fault of our staff or our coaches. It's just like, what makes a fighter? What is a fighter prepared to do that a normal person is not prepared to do? That can create challenging situations for conversations with the athletes in terms of what they should or shouldn't be doing at any moment in time, how they're modifying the training or whether they're removing themselves from training like that. That's really tough as a conversation. So seeing athletes that are clearly training injured, continuing to exacerbate a chronic injury, for example, like you keep doing this wrestling drill or you keep doing these warm-ups and it's not helping this cervical disc or whatever it may be, like you've got to stop. That's just frustrating when our medical team are giving them guidance, but there's just a inherent process to continue to go through. Like I say, the fighters are going to go through the pain, work through the pain, but they might not necessarily need to be in pain just through some behavioral habits. The other one on that side of things is sparring. It's always the white elephant in the room. How much sparring are you supposed to do? Max Holloway recently, a couple of years ago, talked about doing a full camp with no sparring. That's a guy that's pretty mature in his UFC pedigree and has lots of fights and might not necessarily need to do live sparring anymore. But then you definitely see other fighters and you're like, holy shit, you're getting pounded too many times on a week-to-week basis, and sparring is destroying your standards right now. Over-sparring is one that's frustrating. And then certainly some of the nutritional tactics that we see, you would hope that people are a little bit more streetwise, a little bit more understanding of how they use caloric restriction and dehydration tactics, but do it in such a way that is more around career longevity rather than killing yourself on a camp-to-camp basis. through some simple engagement in science and training theory that we've got good evidence for now. So those are some that really spring out to me for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
What I will say as well is that I personally believe that overreaching is endemic in combat sport. It's a wide sweeping brush that I'm painting the whole community with, and that's not to be derogatory, but I just think by the nature of the sport, the complexity of it, I think a good portion, a good deal of our athlete population are overreaching.
What do you mean by that? What does overreaching look like for you?
Overreaching is a short-term reduction in performance that can obviously be returned to a baseline standard with the removal of a training stressor. It's not yet a point at which you've reached overtraining, which is a chronic underperformance syndrome, a chronic underperformance state. What I mean by that is that I think by the nature of combative and MMA training, that our athletes put themselves in overreach states, so they're actually underperforming on a pretty regular basis as a consequence of fatigue, of inflammation, of pain, of soreness, of just the wear and tear of the grind. It's pretty endemic that people are underperforming because of the attrition on their body. Now, they've not yet got to a true overtraining state, which is a chronic physiological condition, but they're certainly in a hole a lot of the time. And I think that's part of the challenge with this sport as well.
Yeah.
If you identified someone who's sort of presenting with overtraining, how would you approach it from a strategy standpoint? Would you grade the training stimulus back? Would you take them out of the game completely and focus on more recovery-based strategies? How would you approach it?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is we've got to educate them around what's going to lead to that. And I know that that's an easy response to a question, like you've got to teach them. But we're not in a position to say, all right, stop training. The fighter is going to fight. The fighter is going to want to fight. They're wired a particular way, right? So we've got to, again, remember that these guys and girls are going to want to go. For us, it's pulling the horses back, but doing it in a tactical way. So, again, it's just a little bit of enlightenment around down regulation or doing some meditation or some mindfulness stuff for 5 minutes after practice. When you've been on the mats and you've been going hard, just go in a corner and take 5 minutes just to kind of down-regulate, something like that. We don't need to necessarily do ice baths and jacuzzis and compression tights. Of course, that's going to be helpful if we look at certain modalities that you align with, and the placebo effect in recovery is real. So it's about finding what modality or what principle someone really believes helps them kind of down-regulate a bit. But it's everything from reevaluating their training week and how they build out their training across the week. And can we potentially drop a session 1 week, or instead of doing 5 rounds, can we just do 3 5-minute rounds? Can we just pull a little bit out for a week and just give you like that rebound opportunity? And then other things are more orientated around, are you sleeping well? Are you fueling your training? Are you refueling after training? Are you hydrating properly? And then you're into recovery modalities and things that can potentially help you. And that's everything from meditation and mindfulness through to ice baths or whatever it may be. So for us, it's just looking at small wins and just small behavioral changes that they can make on a consistent basis for maybe a week or two. And then we'll monitor, does that give you some alleviation? And we've not totally blown up your training program and your training exposure that way.
That's a powerful message. I've seen people going on arduous training courses in a military context. And there's an expectation. I think people go in thinking they have to be a certain standard, and it's often the wrong standard. They often overestimate what it takes to get through these courses. And they'll spend months in this overreaching state trying to improve their physiological capability to get up and over a mountain or to do these hard things. And then when they get onto that course, they'd injure themselves. They're actually reducing the odds of them successfully passing that course because of the months of overreaching or even overtraining for a lot of them. So I think it's interesting to me that you're still seeing that in professional fighting, because I see it a lot, and trying to help people recognize that sometimes less is more. Recovery is very important, and redlining every day is not the way to maintain that level of performance.
Yeah, literally another conversation I had today. We've been here 8 years at the Performance Institute. We've made so many inroads to the sport. We've provided so much support, and hopefully the fighters have appreciated it. But we're still seeing people that are training too much and that redline every single session, and the concept of daily undulating load management is still not something that's considered. And They're just fighters and they want to win every workout.
Yep.
They want to win all the time. I've got two kind of hypotheses that I'm trying to figure out and work through myself. One is this endemic nature of overreaching in our sport, and the other one is kind of an endemic allostatic load. An allostatic load is related to your central nervous system, and ultimately, because our athletes are literally the fight or flight response, right? So sympathetic drive, fight or flight response. We all know about that from evolution. Our athletes are fighters. Therefore, whenever they go onto the mats to do their job, 2 times a day, 3, sometimes even 4 times a day, it's fight or flight response. It's sympathetic drive all the time. And then you expose that across weeks and months, and you have this humming white noise of a fridge in the corner that is your sympathetic drive that is just there constantly. And there is a limited ability to truly downregulate and hit parasympathetic response to offset that sympathetic load. So that's called allostatic loads. And again, that's another thing I think is our community, our athletes are exposed to this allostatic overload of sympathetic drive that is constantly on, constantly go, because they're fighters. So they now have to purposefully be more apparent and more aware of the need to hit down regulation, to actually take the time to try and down regulate. Because if all you ever do is hit that sympathetic arousal and it's fight or flight and I'm just supercharged and my nervous system is getting blown up, that's not going to give you longevity of health, wellness, injury susceptibility that you spoke about, all these different types of things. So again, another thing that we see that I think is a community-wide challenge for the fight community as well.
Yeah, I see the same thing every day.
It's interesting you talk about allostatic load there, because there's a lot of research now coming out with military populations looking at that concept. They're looking at the multitude of stressors which are posed upon individuals, may that be in training or the operational environment. Because I think for a long time people have been, the operational stressors are extreme, but they've looked at it in isolation. And only now are we starting to see joined up thinking where people are looking at it as a collective impact. And I think what's been interesting, it's been masked where people have went, if they're military, it must be some sort of mental health issue, it must be PTSD. But what we're finding in a lot of populations, that's not the case. There's not a mental health issue. It's a neurophysiological issue here. The amount of stressors and the activation of that sympathetic nervous system has been consistent for so long that they've just burnt out, so to speak. The contextual demands of what they're having to do is burning them out, and it's good to see that these concepts and conversations are being had now, and people are starting to work, right, look at it from different lenses, but we're all seeing the same thing. I think that's a topic I could go on about for hours if I'm honest, so I think we're running out of time, but that's a real interesting point.
I think, again, just another area where I think there's so much synergy between, in particular, military operators and then the professional side of combat athletes that I work with.
Duncan, we've had a great conversation. I've really enjoyed today's chat. I'm going to go and watch some old school MMA YouTube clips in a minute.
Soccer kicks to the head and stuff like that.
That's it. Overweight men with mullets from the early 80s.
You'd suit a mullet, mate, if you could grow.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, thanks, JP. But Duncan, what we like to do on this show is to hand it over to you to wrap it up for us.
Oh, wow.
A final thought around maybe something you've not talked about yet that you feel is really important, something you have talked about that you just want to reiterate. So really over to you.
Yeah, no, listen, thank you. It's been great just riffing with you guys today, and hopefully some of the thoughts and ideas and things I've shared have resonated with you guys and others that are listening. So thank you to everyone for listening into this, and hopefully you got something from it. I always come back to the humanistic side of it. We're not working with robots, we're working with people. I don't work in a sports industry, I work in a people industry. And I think it's critical that you've got to understand who's your client, or who's in front of you, or who you're trying to support, or who you're trying to influence. We're trying to get grown adults to do things they don't want to do to get to where they want to go. And I think that's kind of a really interesting dynamic that, yes, we've got lots of research and training science and theory that just becomes more and more salient and more impactful. But at the end of the day, I just want to work in a way that draws on all of that science, but never neglects and never forgets that, we're working with people and their emotions and their behaviors, and everyone's different. And even in a population of 700 world-class UFC fighters, they're all different. Some are headbutting lockers going into competition, others are sitting in the corner crying, others are laughing and joking, others are silent. Everyone is handling stresses in different ways and in a different fashion, but that's what they perceive is best for them. And then we've got to work with these individuals and with these people to say, okay, how do we optimize that? How do we maximize the potential and the ROI, for want of a better way of saying it? To make sure that the return on your efforts is maximizing and optimizing your potential. And that's my mantra in terms of my career. Is I'm here to help people optimize themselves, and there's so many different ways to do that.
Brilliant. Awesome, Duncan. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great way to wrap up. And if people want to learn about the Performance Institute or follow you, is there a best way to do that?
I mean, yeah, the UFCPI.com is our website for the UFC Performance Institute. I'm on Instagram and X and LinkedIn as Dr._Duncan_French in most platforms, I believe. So yeah, happy to have anyone reach out and chat.
Great. We'll get those in the show notes. Duncan, thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you.
That's it for this week's episode of the Optimising Human Performance podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and if you found this valuable, take a moment to rate and review the podcast. If you know someone who'd benefit from today's conversation, then please share this with them. We're always keen to hear your thoughts. If you have feedback, guest suggestions, or topics that you'd love us to cover, then email us at info@ophp.co.uk or connect with us on LinkedIn. Until next time, keep striving, keep improving, and keep optimizing your performance.